Hey folks, glad to see you again. Um, Sorry it's been a couple weeks since I've joined you. Had a few things I had to get taken care of. I have a contest that's coming up that I'm hosting. It's a high school contest called Poetry Out Loud. It's for high school students here in the Savannah area who compete reciting poetry and then go on from the regional to the state, and then they participate in a national contest. It's very exciting for these young students, and but it takes some organization and time, and so I've been spending a little bit of time doing that. Also, I'm getting ready for a retreat that I put on every year called the Ossabaw Island Writers Retreat, and in that retreat, I bring over several faculty members, fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, and they work with writers on Ossabaw Island, which is a barrier island off the coast of Georgia here, and we spent about 5-6 days together and working on their publications and their works, and try to get them ready to get published. So, but I did want to get back with you today and touch base really briefly and talk a little bit about what we're doing here with poetry. I love poetry. It's kind of my entry into creative writing was through poetry. One of the things I love about poetry is that it focuses so much on the word, and to me, the word is the most beautiful thing that we have as human beings. It's the one thing that separates us from all the other creatures is that we have a language that allows us to communicate with each other and with ourselves about the past and the present and the future. And we can do it in such a way as to really bring the emotions and the feelings out in our the readers, the people that we're trying to communicate with. So let's talk a little bit about what is a poem, and about how we want to approach writing a poem. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that the main function of a poem is to convey an idea or an emotion using beautiful language. And when I say beautiful language, that doesn't mean that we have to use over flowery words. It means that the way the words are put together are beautifully put together. They're put together in such a way as to convey beauty and truth and love like nothing else can. Poetry really is the first language art that we human beings have started writing. We didn't write fiction for thousands of years. In fact, fiction until Don Quixote in the 1600s, Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. That's considered the first fiction work. But really, the fiction that we read today is much more closely linked to maybe the 19th century. We might think of Christmas Carol, right? Many of you have probably seen that, so Charles Dickens, that kind of storytelling was early 19th century. So it's only been around for fiction writing's only been around for 150, maybe 175 years. Creative nonfiction we really haven't had creative nonfiction except for the last 50 or 60 years. I mean, before that we had nonfiction, but that was mostly considered biographies and maybe journalism, feature writing. So poetry, though, has been around for thousands of years, ancient times. The first, at least some of the first Western poetry that was written was, you may know, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. So that dates, those stories date back 1200 BCE, and probably the script was written in 400 or 500 BCE. So yeah, it's been around a while, and for good reason. Many argue that it captures in language better than anything else the essence of what it is to be human. So how does it do that? Well, it uses forms, it uses particular devices, literary devices, to create effects on the reader. So it paints a picture of what the poet feels about things, about people, ideas, concepts, even objects. It grabs the attention of the audience and uses vivid imagination, emotional shades, figurative language, metaphor, simile, and other rhetorical devices. But the supreme function of the poem really is to transform imagery and words into a verse form, to touch the hearts and minds of the readers, and and maybe most importantly, arouse the sentiments of their readers through the versification, through the poetry. You can think of how a song, I mean, which, poems and songs are intricately related. We didn't have music as we understand it today until about the 14th century. And so poems were considered songs, and were called songs until that time. So it was just like using your words, your voice, and language to create the same effect that a song would create in the hearts of the listeners. Um, so, so what do we want to think about when it comes to writing our poetry? Well, a couple of things. Uh, First, I want you to relax and remember that most of you, or many of you, are new to this. And even those of you who have been writing poetry since you were young, um, uh, it takes time and it takes experience. What we're trying to put in our poems are revelations, as it were. Um, the creative idea, the creative response comes from being able to deeply feel something about an object or a thing or an idea. To get to something new that hasn't been noticed before about love, about life, about what truth is. What is truth, and how do we know it when we see it? What is beautiful? What makes something beautiful? Is it just in the eye of the beholder, really? Maybe it is. Um, but if it is, then how can we ever be able to judge anything that's beautiful and for us all to agree on it? I mean, we've all experienced being with friends and even strangers, and noticing something, and it affects us deeply. Part of the humanities is this idea of being in the humanities and working in the humanities and trying to promote the humanities. The idea of arts and humanities is the idea that art can somehow focus the human into an idea of what it is to be human. That there's something that can connect us all together, that can help us to be unified instead of divided, instead of atomized into a culture and world where no one can agree with anyone else, where we have no foundation upon which to stand when we say this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, this is love, this is hate. So poetry is one of the best ways of really digging down into the meanings of those things. And many times we take objects or people and circumstances and have a narrative, and in that narrative, we're speaking at kind of the first level of meaning, which is like showing the reader exactly what something is clearly. And then beneath that, though, there are other levels of meaning that come in, that help us to understand that something else is going on here. There's a poem. Let me look it up here very quickly. This is called. This is by Robert Frost, one of the last well-known American poets that kind of has a name that we all kind of recognize. Maybe you don't. You should if you don't. But Robert Frost, he was writing back in the early to mid 20th century, he read a poem at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. So 1960, 1960, 1960, to the 1960s. But he wrote for many years before that. This is a poem called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to break it down a little bit and try to demonstrate what I was just talking about. All right, hang on a second here. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. And you can look this up. If you go to, there's a few wonderful references that you can, and resources you can use for this, but there's a place called poetryfoundation.org. That's poetryfoundation, all one word, .org. And there you'll find lots of poems, lots of poets, lots of the history of the poets, and get to know them better. So I encourage you to go there and check that out. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. My house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and snowy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. So the first level image here is pretty straightforward. There's someone riding a sleigh through the woods, and this is, you have to think maybe 1930s, 1940s. They have a horse. This is in New England. As they pass by the woods, he says, whose woods these are? I think I know. In other words, I don't really know whose woods these are, but maybe, I think I do maybe know who they are. But it'll be okay because he's not going to see me stopping here because he lives in the village. So it'll be fine. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So we know it's a snowy evening. It's wintertime, right? My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. So his horse, who is this combination, because we're going to get this juxtaposition of man and nature. And a lot of poems are about kind of this idea of where do we belong? Where does the human belong in this world of ours? Are we nature? Are we separate from nature? Are we with nature? Is there a combination of those two going on? So a lot of poems and a lot of poets kind of contemplate that. Again, poems should be about big ideas, big issues. Even if you don't have to talk about big things, though, to be about big ideas, as you'll see in this poem, right? At the surface level, riding by some woods, stops. He thinks about the horse. So what's up with the horse? Well, the horse is pulling him, so it's domesticated, but it's not domesticated too. It's a wild animal. It's been reined in, literally reined in, using the reins on a sleigh, by humankind. So the horse is kind of out of his form. In other words, he's kind of nervous because he's like, why are we stopping here? Why aren't we going home? We should be going where we usually go when we go, but it's not. And so that's kind of weird and almost like paradoxical, because the horse should feel comfortable out in the wild, running around, but this horse doesn't. So we have this tension going on with the horse even struggling between this idea of nature and man. To stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake. So there's a frozen lake and woods, okay? And they're between it. So on one side is a frozen lake, the other side is the woods, right? And they're between these two. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. So the darkest evening of the year is the winter solstice. And so, what we know about winter, and especially when it comes to poetry and when it comes to any kind of symbolism, if we're looking, and poems are full of symbols. Words are full of symbols. Words are symbols. They're just you think about a word. You draw one line on a board that is just a line on a board. Or it could be the letter I, depending on what language, what alphabet you're used to reading. You draw a line with another line on top of it, well then it could be a mathematical formula for an angle, or it could be a T. And then you put another two lines and a line across the middle, and it could be a hurdle to jump over, or it could be an H. So even our language is just symbols. The letters for our language are symbols. The is made out of just lines that we, as humans, put meaning onto. So we're always kind of looking at words and thinking about words in a symbolic way. So symbolism in poetry, a lot of times when seasons are mentioned, then you can think about the human in relation to seasons. So we have spring and summer and winter and fall. So the spring of our life would be when we're first born, when we're young, when we're infants and we need lots of care and we're very delicate and tender. And then the summer comes along, and that's when we start blossoming out. You know, we go to adolescence and into older, you know, young adulthood, and going through, you know, even the college years. And then that autumn comes along. That's when things come into fullness of the harvest. That's when, you know, between, I don't know, 35 to 55, you're kind of living that part of your life where you're really adding things to your life and things are becoming full. And then the winter of life is towards the end. You've already harvested, and now things, and at the end, of course, is death. At the end, it's the end of life. It's death, it's the darkness, it's the cold, it's the chill. So here, it's the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. Again, that kind of nervousness and saying, you know, what's going on here? The only other sound is the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. So notice how nature, the only sound besides this nervous horse, is nature, being nature. Nature, unlike humans, nature doesn't wrestle. It doesn't wrestle with what it is, right? A hawk is a hawk. When a hawk flies around looking for prey and it sees it, it dives down and it grabs that prey and it goes back up and it eats it, or it misses it. Either way, let's say if it misses the prey, it went down, it doesn't have to then go and sit at a psychotherapist office and talk about how, oh, I'm a failure. I can't believe I missed the mouse. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm the worst hawk in the world. No, it just circles around and finds another rat or mouse or whatever it is and dives and gets it. It's okay. So nature is cool with itself, you know. Notice that the wind is easy. It's an easy wind. And the flake from the snow is a downy flake, right? It's a very soft flake. It's just nature. It's what it is. The horse, on the other hand, that's been kind of in between this human world and the animal world is nervous. It's not quite fitting there, not comfortable. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. So that's another thing, you know. We're between the woods and the lake. And, you know, lakes, if you think about water, a lot of times water's, although it can have a death feel to it, there's also a beginning or a renewal, or, you know, we get bathed to get clean. We are baptized and are reborn, if you know, in certain cultures and certain religious beliefs, right? Think about how we love to go to the beach and swim. We love to get out in the water. There's something about getting in the water and feeling revived and alive again. And we get out and something, you know, it just feels like we've been revivicated, right? Energized. So there's the water on the one side, but on the other side are the woods, the dark and deep woods. What's in the darkness? You can't see what's in the darkness. You don't know what's there past the woods, what's in that darkness, right? What's at the end of the life when we get to the very end? Right? What is there? So that mystery is there, right? He says, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And he repeats that line, and miles to go before I sleep, right? So again, on the upper surface level, he's just literally thinking, yeah, this is kind of pretty. They're dark and they're deep, but I got a lot to do. I got to get home. I can't just, and night time's here. I need to get some sleep. We're reading it on the other level, that deeper level, the metaphorical level, the symbolic level. And we see that he's really talking about, he's got a lot to get done before he's ready to end his life, before he's ready to give up and say, okay, it's done, right? So that is what we call a sonnet. And a sonnet has a very particular pattern to it. It's 14 lines. If you look at this poem online, you'll see that lines 1 and 4 rhyme in every one of the stanzas. There are 4 stanzas here. The first 3 stanzas are 4 lines each, and then the last stanza is 2 lines. And so you have this same pattern repeated all the way through until the last 2 lines, and there's a couplet, meaning the 2 words at the end of the line are the rhyming words. So the pattern of it is A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, E, F, F, E, G, G. That would be a pattern of the rhyming words at the end of the line, right? So you can see how a poem like that could really kind of capture us just on that kind of sound level and the way it sounds as it's read, and on this literal level where it sounds like, oh, it's a pretty poem, that's a nice poem, but then also this deeper level that comes on, right? So I want you to practice. I've given you copies of in the units. I'm pretty sure that I have. And in your book, you can read in the books, when you're reading the poems, look at the examples where you can see how the poet is using these elements. And there's also, you'll see it throughout the semester, like I'm Unit 3, Week 3, Southern Poetry Review 59-2. I'm the associate editor of Southern Poetry Review, which is one of the top 5 poetry reviews in the world, and we have great poems in there. So read through the poems in that, and that's a PDF of our issue 59-2. You read through the poems in there, copy them, mimic them, use what other people have done as your guide, your example of how you might structure the poem, put it together using all those elements of poetry that the book talks about and that my notes talk about. I mean, I put a lot of notes in here for your edification, the notes on meters, rhythms, terms, poetry terms, how to scan for rhythm. But for this week, for week 4, I'm asking you to write what we call a free verse poem, and that means that you don't have to have any particular rhyming scheme. You don't have to have any particular metrical scheme to it. What I want you to do, though, is this is a way for you to learn the terms, learn how to recognize these elements of poetry: alliteration, assonance, internal rhyming, caesura, in-stop lines, run-on lines. Okay. So that's enough for today, for right now. If you have questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can. I really appreciate the work you're doing in the class so far. I'll have your latest work that you've turned in. I should be able to get it back to you here in the next couple days. Okay. Discussion posts 2 and 3. I'll be working on them. So, yeah, I hope you have a great couple days, a great week. Don't stress about things. Revision is the key to poetry, by the way, and you got to please remember that. Right, your first draft is probably not going to be great. Mine isn't. I have to revise and revise and revise my work. Thank God there's a revision, because it gives me the opportunity to learn and improve and make that poem better and better and better. So as you work through this semester and you take these elements of poetry and you apply them to your fiction, you apply them to your creative nonfiction, and you go back and you do revisions for the final portfolio, then you will see the improvement, and I hope at least you'll come to, if nothing else, to appreciate the art and craft that is inherent in a work of poetry. All right, have a great one, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.